Welcome everybody to this session, and it's so great to see everybody again. Hopefully by next year we'll be doing this in person, regardless of the fact that we are virtual now. It's really refreshing to have everyone converge again and have the opportunity to discuss some of the issues affecting progress on the continent. My name is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am a fellow here at Atlas Network at the Center for African Prosperity. So this session it's going to be much more interactive than the last two sessions. So by the 20 or 25 minutes mark, I will encourage you, my colleagues, to indicate your contribution by asking questions or by giving comments, because we are all in this civil society sphere. So we want to learn from one another. So I think in 2010, we can remember what we were each of us were doing. I mean, for me, I can remember what I was doing in 2010, because 2010 was it wasn't that far away. So just 12 years ago. You can remember the travels we made or the friends we made in 2010. However, since that time, the continent has had nothing less than 48 coups, failed, successful coups. 48 since 2010. That's a huge number. Africa itself only has about, is it 43 or 53 or 54 countries. So for us to have about 48 coups, that is a huge concern. But in the last 2 years, we've had 10 of such failed, successful, flopped coups on the continent. 10. And I guess for a lot of people, that will give us a sense of nostalgia back to the 70s and the 80s, where coups was just everywhere on the continent. So the question then becomes, why are we seeing this, should I say, increase in coups across the continent? And I guess as much as we are more concerned about issues affecting human flourishing, freedom, economic, I think we really cannot neglect peace and security. And key in that regard is coup on the continent. So to help us make a better sense of this burning topic are two awesome scholars. First is Professor Moses Kisa, who is an associate professor of political science, holding a joint appointment in Africana Studies at North Carolina State University, and was until June this year a visiting fellow at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies South Africa. He graduated from Makerere University in Kampala and Northwestern University with a PhD and an MA. Welcome, Professor Kisa. We also have Professor Philip Rossler, who is the Margaret Hamilton Associate Professor of Government at William & Mary, where he also serves as the Associate Chair of the Government Department, Co-Director of the Digital Inclusion and Governance Lab, and Director of the Africa Research Center at William & Mary's Global Research Institute. He received his BA from Indiana University and his PhD from the University of Maryland. He has held fellowships at Stanford and Oxford. Welcome, Professor Rossler. All right, just to jump straight into it, why are we seeing this resurgence in the number of coups? To start with you, Professor Moses, what do you think is the main reason? You published a lot of books about this topic, but you want to help us make a better sense of it. Why?
Thank you, Ibrahim. I hope you can all hear me. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you're joining us. Thank you, Ibrahim, and your colleagues for organizing this very important conversation. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I really appreciate. The resurgence in military coups over the last few years definitely represents a big turnaround in African political development, because for quite some time, beginning in the early 2000s, the incidence of coup actions on the continent had actually been on the downward. There had been significant decline in the number of successful military coups that were happening on the continent. As you alluded to in your introductory remarks, Ibrahim, there was a time when Africa as a continent was a continent of coups. That is especially the 1970s, but particularly the 1990s as a decade were the peak period where more than 30 successful coups happened across the African continent. Between 1960 and 1990, on average, every decade, there were at least 22 successful coups in the continent of Africa. And by 1990, there had been more than 70 successful coups across the continent, and at least 33 African states had experienced one successful coup. That means more than 2/3 of the continent had had a coup. There was only a small minority of countries, the exception, about 1/3 of the continent where coups had not happened. Otherwise, about 70% of the continent had had coups by 1990. And by 2012, the coup count in the continent had dramatically declined. So the first decade of the current century, especially after the African Union had been established, the AU became a very important actor in pushing back against military coups, because during the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, the norm that existed at the time was that a military ruler and a military government were welcome to the table after they came to power. The African Union changed that norm and practice to sanctioning and disqualifying countries and governments that came to power by military coup. So by the mid-2000s, coups had started declining in Africa, and that trend of decline continued into the 2010s. So the first 2 decades of the current century, that is the 2000s and the 2010s, had less than 10 successful military coups until the resurgency that we witnessed beginning in 2019, and especially 2020 and 2021. So I think that then raises the question that you aptly put across, Ibrahim. Why has that happened? I still think that Africa is in a much better place in terms of the role of the military and its intrusive activities today than the continent was 20, 30 years ago. Recent events, of course, caused a lot of alarm, and military coups have the notoriety of making big headlines. But the thing is that when you take a broader spectrum and a longer term view, the situation is not as bad as it does appear, because this is just the beginning of the decade of the 2020s. We don't know what's going to happen ahead. But so to answer your question, I think there are a number of factors that have been at play, and I'm going to quickly run through those, and then I'll pause such that Philip can take over. The first, I think, is that the African Union has been fairly inconsistent, and that has not helped matters. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States in West Africa, and the African Union in the 2000s and partly in 2010s did decisively stand up against military intrusions in civilian politics in ways that helped in deterring other possible military interventions. But the African Union hasn't been very consistent. When the military took over in Mali in 2020, and then we had similar actions in Burkina Faso, in Guinea. There was a soft coup in Chad, Then earlier on, the military had taken over in Sudan, in Zimbabwe as well, when Robert Mugabe was kicked out in 2019. The African Union, dilly-dallied and did not come out as, emphatically as it had done previously. So the AU, together with the sub-regional entities, ECOWAS in West Africa, the EAC in Eastern Africa, SADC in Southern Africa, they could have helped, I think, push back by being more forceful and helping to deter. But I think at a fundamental domestic political level, the key issue really has been the state of political institutions and the state capacities of different African countries. If you look at what has been happening in the Sahel and contributed to pushing military intrusions and interventions, the state of the state and the ability or inability of governments to function, particularly in providing basic security, but also basic social services, did create an environment of disillusionment among the military ranks and provided sort of perfect excuse for the military takeovers. That's what happened in Burkina Faso. It's what happened in Mali. It's what happened in the Sudan as well. So the state and the capacity of civilian institutions does provide, the basis and justification for military interventions.
Right. Yeah. So again, we can talk about the role of the African Union and ECOWAS for forever. However, I want to get your opinion, Professor Rosler. So there have been a lot of people who make this case that military coups aren't so bad on the continent compared to elsewhere, compared to what we had 30 years ago. But as we know, the military, the saying goes that the best of the military is always worse than the worst of the civilian. I mean, that could be debated. However, do you think there's any justification? Because you look at the place where these military coups have happened. In most cases, they've brought back the economic development of those countries a few years back. You look at Guinea, Sudan, Mali, they're struggling economic-wise. I mean, you can argue about the case of COVID-19 and climate change, but these coups are affecting the economies of this country. So in your sense, do you think there can be any justification to have military coups on the continent?
Yes, wow, great question, Ibrahim. And let me just thank the Atlas Network, like Moses did, for hosting this wonderful conference, but also specifically this event. And we really want to hear from as many as we can in this session to get your thoughts and inputs, especially those on the front lines working with civil society organizations. But to your question, Ibrahim, yeah, so you rightfully acknowledge that military coups are alternations of power, right? And that military coups, the use of force, can be an accountability mechanism, right? This is holding to account, incumbents who are failing, potentially their people. And I think what's been disconcerting about some of the coups we've seen over the past 2 years is that they've been celebrated in some quarters, right? People in the streets, we have to be careful, of course, how we read that, but there is an appetite among some, sectors of these countries supporting these alternations of power, right? So we have to acknowledge that the military is stepping in, tapping into deep discontent due to insecurity, right? Due to failed public policies, due to economic crises. And to some people, they see, maybe this alternation of power is going to be a good thing, right? But of course, just because it's an alternation of power, just because this is, certain elites trying to, hold account, we also have to be very careful of the path we're going down. And I think that's really important to think about when we think about what precedents this sets in terms of re-legitimating politics by force. And even though force is an accountability mechanism, it is not our preferred accountability mechanism, right? Because once we start using force, of course, it has this dynamic effect where others, turn to force, and it's very difficult to rein it back in and to civilianize rule again, and that. So I think that's very important. So, so to kind of shift your questions, we have to ask, why were other accountability mechanisms failing, right? Such that the military was entering politics and had a sufficient support base either within the military, the weakness of civilian governments, international support, regional support to execute these coups d'etats. And I think there we have to look at some of the root factors, root causes. I think, Moses did an excellent job of contextualizing this coup epidemic that we're seeing. I think it is very important that it is quite different. The 2020s are quite different from where we were in the 1970s and 1980s. When we look at the band of coups d'etats, we see them, going from Sudan, down to Guinea-Bissau, right? They've been concentrated in the Sahel and West Africa. And we have to think, well, what are some of the conditions within these countries? And we have ongoing military conflicts, right? So we have the militarization of politics. So there's a role for the military in politics. So they have already this kind of privileged position. We have, of course, counterterrorism campaigns that have been ongoing, over the last 20 years, but of course intensified over the last 10 years. So foreign military actors, foreign states trying to strengthen the military, further kind of securitizing politics. This combined, of course, with the shock of from the COVID-19 pandemic, economic crisis, and other governance challenges. As Moses referred to, the challenges of state capacity and providing public goods. So so these challenges led to discontent, the weakness of the incumbent regimes, and the military stepping in. But I don't see any room for good coups in anywhere, because I just fear the path this takes us down, and Mali is a very good example, right? So we have the first coup, right, which is ostensibly because of these concerns of insecurity, corruption, bad governance, and we have the first coup. But then when we have politics over distribution of power within the government, and then we have the use of a coup again to try to entrench, consolidate power when some in the military feel like they're losing their ground. So we're then caught in this vicious cycle. So I think the question for us today is really, how do we strengthen accountability mechanisms? How do we address some of these underlying causes such that there's no room for the military to serve as our lever of alternating power? Right. And I think Moses is exactly right. There's a very important role for the African Union, ECOWAS, other international actors, regional actors, and then there's also this bottom-up role for civil society as well. So we have to think about that together, and we shouldn't also lose sight, of course, of civil-military relations and what role that plays. But I think, yeah, I mean, we have this tendency to say we want the quick fix, and if a few guys with guns can quickly replace a leader we don't like, because of their poor governance. It's tempting to, it's seductive to see that as an answer. But I'm afraid, I fear where this leads. And that's why, when we look at the 70s and 80s, what happens is politics by force, it becomes contagious, it spreads. And that's why, even though this belt of coups we've seen in the past 2 years, I think it's important that, look, this is not all of Africa. This is the Sahel and West Africa. But let us not also lose sight that what happens in the Sahel and West Africa affects all of Africa.
All right. So yeah, I love the fact that you point emphasize the fact that this conversation is much about the civil society and the role, because majority of the people here actually work for think tanks and public policy organizations. So in the second half of the conversation, we're going to look at what our partners can do, as you said, from the bottom up, to address this problem, rather than wait for ECOWAS and the African Union, which, I mean, in my opinion, that one's really helped in the past. Okay, but you also mentioned something regarding the alternation of power, that people are now looking at the military as, quick fix for economic problems, corruption, endemic corruption. But we really cannot be blind to the fact that in African societies before colonization, the military was pretty much close to the executive, and in some places you can't even separate the monarch from the military. The monarch himself, or the commander in chief, actually go to the field. So people sometimes say that Africans applauding the coup in Mali or the coup in Guinea is actually them, being Africans, that this is our own kind of democracy. This is our own way, kind of, governance. And I think that brings into question that, as Western liberal democracy in Africa failed, or is it prompting people to now respond? Is it creating this new response, this alternate power, or alternate quest for power, urge for power among Africans? I want to know what you feel, Professor Skisa, if you can answer that really quick before we go to Professor Ressler.
Yeah, I think there has always been a general trend whenever the military has overthrown a civilian government, overthrown another military government in an African country. Since the 1960s, by the way, you always see street celebrations. So it's never a new thing at all when there are, outbreaks of spontaneous outbreaks of jubilations whenever the military takes over. But I think it all comes down to the failed promises of the African post-colonial state and the government, and the disillusionments with, as you mentioned, liberal democracy has, for the most part, not delivered the kind of quality of government and quality of public services and goods and services that African publics, expect and require. So, and the situation in the Sahel, I think, is very much emblematic of sort of the failed governance frameworks that most African states have been operating with, because for the most part, liberal democracy, or whatever you want to call it, in many African states has been nothing more than, elite accommodations and elite power sharing pacts that end at the top level with very little in terms of actually serving the basics and the needs of the wider public. And so you end up with citizens who are desperate for any form of change, and when the guys in uniform see that there's a moment of disillusionment, then they pounce and grab power. For the most part, many of these military coups have been power grabs, really. The fellows in uniform have never been any better rulers in Africa than civilian governments. They preside over precisely the same decay and dysfunction. But for the public, for the ordinary person, any form of change is seen as something welcome. And I think that's how we could interpret this.
All right, thank you, Professor Moses. So, Professor Kisa, Ressler, do you think this urge, it's as I asked earlier, is this a problem, or is it people just being tired of the status quo, that they're so ready to embrace any form of change. But the reason I'm asking this question is because it's giving folks, for example, after saying in Guinea and Mali, this sense of legitimacy. I mean, the guys that did the counter coups in Mali, they were using this idea. They want us to come in. So you can see them jubilating in the streets. So we have the legitimacy. I mean, legitimacy is a component of democracy. So going back to my question, how can we reinvent liberal democracy, maybe not Western liberal democracy in the African context, so much that it will accommodate, or as you use the word accommodate, it will be proof to any form of abuse of power or any other problem that often give rise to this coup. So in your own opinion, do you think there is a way for us to edit democracy as we know it in the African continent to avoid these military coups?
Yeah, so yeah, I think one of the when we think about military coups, I mean, some of these, absolutely, as Moses says, I mean, they're power grabs. They're individual, powerful elites using force to increase their share of power. Of course, this is easier when there's widespread discontent, and it's seen as kind of an alternation of power or holding to account these powerful actors. So, I mean, I think, to your question is, I mean, the root cause of some of these coups, like in Guinea, is incumbents who are undermining democratic institutions, right, and staying in power beyond initial term limits, changing the constitution. So the question is, how can we strengthen other institutional constraints that hold account these incumbents? And to Moses's point, how do we make liberal democracy work, right? So liberal democracy will be more effective if elected governments and these elite PACs, individuals feel constrained by the public to invest in public goods, and we should mention there's a substantial body of evidence looking at investments in public goods across countries in Africa before and after kind of the institutionalization of democracy, or institutionalization of regular competitive elections. And we can show that, yes, investment in public goods qualitatively changes when we have competitive elections, right? So there is definitely an important accountability mechanism that comes from competitive elections in terms of reducing ethnic favoritism, increasing investment in public goods. It's just not going far enough, right? Those free and fair, those competitive elections are not always free and fair, right? So I think it's really about strengthening institutional quality, strengthening constraints on the incumbents. But like Guinea, Guinea shows, incumbents also know how to use these institutions to strengthen and consolidate their power, right? So I mean, going back, this is a kind of a question for broader discussion, and this goes to a point that Moses, asserted, I think, quite insightfully, is that there's been an important change regionally that we're all aware of. The African Union has tried to, end, military coups and try to strengthen this anti-coup norm by decertifying, groups that come to power through force, right? And this was a radical change from the past, as Moses said, before anyone had a seat at the table. No matter how you captured the capital city, you would then be recognized. That has now changed, right? That you will be suspended from the African Union if you come to politics, if you use force to come to power. Now, there's been some slippage there that we should talk about, right? We could talk about the case of Egypt. We could also talk about, of course, the case of Zimbabwe. where coup perpetrators are learning. I think there's been learning on the African Union side, but there's been also been learning on the military side. But the point I want to make now is that as you have this new anti-coup norm, yes, we will decertify you if you come to power via coup d'etat or from armed rebellion. There was an imbalance in this constitutionalism in which that a similar standard was not applied for incumbents who undermine democratic institutions, through rigging elections, through changing the constitution to stay in power. Now, part of this is because that is a bit of a grayer zone, right? Is a constitutional referendum, does that represent a power grab, or does that represent, of course, the support, public support and a democratic measure for the incumbent to stay in power? So incumbents knew this was a gray zone and exploited this to consolidate power and stay in power and weaken constraints against them. But in doing so, of course, this undermined democracy and then increased support for alternative measures of regime turnover and entered the coup d'etat. So the question is, how can we strengthen democratic institutions and constraints? And one idea that was floated by ECOWAS was a 2-term limit among all member states, right? That we would not have these gray zones. We would not have endless constitutional referendums by incumbents who could stay in power indefinitely. All member states would abide by 2-term limits, and then we would get this alternation of power. And this is an intriguing idea, right? Because it encourages this alternation of power. It encourages, constraints on incumbents, and we don't need the military to come in. One perhaps downside of this is being imposed, by this regional organization. Is it subverting civil society and democratic organizations and movements who should really be pushing for this internally, like we see, like we saw in Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? Joseph Kabila tried very hard to stay in power, and there was pushback from civil society and social movements. If we had a 2-term limit, would that have subvert the civil society? So I guess the question is, are there rules for like regional? Is there room for regional rules? That can constrain incumbent strength and democracy, or will they inadvertently subvert civil society? Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they will actually strengthen civil society, and they will leave more room for civil society to flourish while keeping the military on the sideline. I mean, a 2-term limit is nice because it's elegant, it's easy, but it's not going to be, of course, a panacea, because it's only going to be as strong as those democratic institutions that can support and uphold it.
I think that's really correct. However, I do have problem with ECOWAS and African Union because, of course, they can suggest these 2-term limits.
Yes.
But as we've seen coup in countries where they have, they've adhered somewhat to the 2-term limits, and it's all, of course, problematic to have a regional organization give this, one-size-fits-all proposal to all its member states. However, my main problem with both ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, and AU is that they, of course, a lot of my colleagues will agree with this, is that they do not come as strong against their colleagues when they are abusing power. We're seeing the case, for example, in North Africa with Tunisia, where the president is just pretty much, sacking every chief judge, closing the cabinet, making himself pretty much lifetime president. We saw the same thing with Alpha Conde in Guinea, where he was abusing power. ECOWAS or AU didn't strongly come against come against these people, but they will start commenting when the military go take power. So I think that is one gray area, perhaps, that the AU and ECOWAS.
Let me just, if I may, just speak to that real quickly, because I think Yeah, that is the problem, of course, if we rely and lean too much on these regional organizations, which are clubs of incumbents, is that they can be fickle, right? And that they can, ultimately they are what, are going to be careful not to constrain their own power too much. And they're also going to be, of course, put realpolitik above all else. And I think we have seen some of that. I think what's been very disconcerting is the African Union worked very hard to build an anti-coup norm, and then it's slowly been eroding. Because some of the military is learning, like the Zimbabwe case is a classic example, right? That where they executed a coup d'état, but they didn't call it a coup d'état. And I was watching this, I was like, no way the African Union lets them get away with this. It's obvious, right? But they let them get away with it, right? And we see slippage as well. I think the cases of Mali, ECOWAS had very strong sanctions. They were trying to push hard for the military for a quick turnover. The military pushed back, and they had to meet the middle ground. Right. So we get sanctions lifted with promise of elections in 2024. That's not what we had in mind when we're thinking about, ECOWAS and AU decertifying military regimes. This is instead allowing these military elites to stay in power for too long. So that is the problem, right? With the relying on these regional rules is realpolitik. Slippage comes into play. South Africa wants Mugabe gone. We defer to South Africa. Oh, Egypt had a coup, but the U.S. is happy. EU happy to accept that. We'll accept that as well. Enough time has passed, right? So we don't want to rely on the club of incumbents to be our democratic safeguard. But they can play a role, and we shouldn't lose sight that a lot of these leaders of ECOWAS, are democratically elected and do. Some of these are true believers who are working hard to try to contain the coup epidemic because they are concerned it's kind of spiraling out of control, and they worry the effects it'll have on democracy. So I think you're exactly right. I think there has been some change among the elites within these organizations, but it shouldn't be our only line of defense.
Right. Yeah. There's been change on paper, but we haven't seen those changes on the ground. The same leaders that are giving us this proposal to change elections, to change the way ECOWAS, AU, SADC address coup are also the one causing problems that is making the military come into power, or people ask for the military to come to power. But anyway, I think it's a good segue into the second segment of the conversation. We have about 20 minutes. So this is where I want to have my colleagues, give comments, 20 seconds comments, ask questions, because this is going to be about what the civil society can do. So if you want to ask a question, please indicate by raising your hand so we can have your question answered. But pending the time we get a hand raised, there are comments in the chat box that I encourage people to read. So talking about solutions or what civil society can do, I guess a good way to start for us, Professor Kisa and Professor Rosler, is to identify, trouble spots. Illegal historians often use that, or what we can call the most recurring possibilities or avenue for us to come in and help the situation. So from your field works, what can you identify as maybe the top two? Just help us list them, the top two areas you think a think tank or a public policy organization can come in and address that will, on the long run, if not immediate, on the long run, prevent a coup. I'm thinking about maybe asking for electoral reform, something like that, but you've done the field work. What are your top two opportunities of policy research or policy advocacy? Just help us list them, then go to our partners. Professor Kisa, just help us list your top two.
Ibrahim, I don't know whether I have top two, but I can definitely sort of make one general comment, which is that we see that African countries that have built a culture of civilian government through civic activism and civic awareness, those countries have either completely steered clear of coups, or if they had coups in the past, the coup culture has been put by the side. So you look at, for example, in West Africa, Ghana is a very good example of a country that sort of rejected military coups. After having many of them in the 60s and 70s, the Ghanaian civil society and the Ghanaian public culture moved in the direction of embracing civilian rule and civic sphere. And I think that has made a difference. Today, it's very difficult for the military in Ghana to do a coup because the public mood and the public, imagination is, although, some Ghanaians, when you speak to them, they may have some sentiments of, wishing that maybe there should be a coup because the politics, the democratic process isn't working well for the public. But I think the generality of the Ghanaian public opinion is decidedly against military intervention via coup. And I think you can find that kind of sentiment in many other countries like Kenya as well. So, Kenyan political landscape is very much geared towards civilian and civic engagement, other than inviting in the military to sort of solve problems that are otherwise, for civilian actors to do. So I would say, I think as a general point, that building a culture of civilian politics and civic action does make a difference. And I think, you can, there are many other, cases you can speak to, including countries like Tanzania. And then you contrast that with countries where militarism, or the military as a central actor, has remained very persistent and permanent. Those are countries where the military intervention is likely to happen because, militarism is very much at the center of political culture.
All right, good. So let's just emphasize that. Culture of civil political engagements, right? Okay, good. So
there's some hands here, Ibrahim, that we can go to. Let me just make one point too, is we shouldn't lose sight of kind of the political economy of militaries. Egypt, Sudan, beyond are great cases where, as we said, the military has been very prominent in these political systems, towards the end of colonialism, at the early decades of independence. They have amassed incredible sources of economic power, right? And that's part of the resistance to civilianizing rule is they don't want to relinquish that economic power. That this is the counter coup in Egypt. This is definitely part of the motivation for the military in Sudan is not to relinquish power. Is they fear its effects on economic power. So we should also think about the economic reforms, speaking of culture, not an expectation that the military, will be the stewards of the economy, right? That they will, run these private corporations, control all this land. So I think also looking at economic reforms is important.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, bro. So we're going to come back to you too later, but I want to hear from Moses Sinkala. Your comment. Moses, can you do like 15 seconds so we can move on to others? Okay, I think we're having problem with Moses' connection. Ibrahim Muwaya, are you ready for us? Your microphone is muted.
I think it is now unmuted. I think it is an interesting conversation, but we need to get the history right. When African independent leaders came into power, they just replaced the position of colonialists to enjoy the privileges that colonialists had before them. And the whole issue of change of government and militarism is about resources, access to resources. So in most countries where the fight against colonialism was by military fighting, you will find that the culture persists. But why do the coups happen? It is because of what Frederick Bashar calls plunder. So the people who are in positions of power use that position to plunder resources. And the others think of getting to those resources by getting into leadership positions. And they will do whatever it takes to get into those positions so that they will also enjoy the privilege. So what can we do as libertarian movements, as think tanks? We have to create a society that believes in the rule of law. We have to preach this message wide, broad, and
Right.
deep.
Okay, rule of law, get that point. Okay, sorry, because I want to make sure we answer as many questions as possible. Yeah, we got here. The main point, rule of law, how civil society to help emphasize the rule of law. Do you have a response or a recommendation for that in maybe 20 seconds, Professor Kisa? The rule of law and civil society.
Well, I think that definitely has to be understood within the broader context of, African government and African governance. Rule of law cannot be seen in isolation, but definitely building strong civilian institutions, whether in civil society or in government as a whole, is incredibly important and makes a difference. Today, if you see African states that are not vulnerable to coups, are the ones that have quite strong, civilian institutions, where you have, as Phil said, the military as a big player historically. Those countries are likely to remain trapped in the coup trap, as well as, of course, the possibility of armed conflict.
Correct. All right, cool. Moses, are you? Anyway, before I come to you, Moses, I'm going to read a couple of comments. This one from Giselle Dutel. Giselle says there has been a change lately. We see in Mali and Guinea that these coups do not seem to be supported by foreign countries. These coups seem truly national. That's actually a good observation. Professor Rosla, do you agree with that? Because I do agree with that. A lot of these past coups in the 70s, 80s were supported by, as we've seen from this classified FBI files now, by American government, by UK government. And although people may argue there could be some support from the foreign governments for some of these coups lately, but do you think that's a positive, that we're not seeing this heavy hand of foreign governments in military coups in Africa?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really insightful point by Giselle there. I think, of course, all the, as Moses was suggesting earlier, every coup leader claims to be, of course, a national champion, and that the coup is representing the national interest, and they use all kinds of patriotic language and slogans, and but I think there is something we're seeing in Mali and Guinea, of course, vis-a-vis France, and the military is tapping in to deep resentment of French policy in the Sahel and French policy towards Africa, and that as a way to kind of try to legitimate their takeover of power. So some resemblance to some of the coups we saw in the early early decades of independence. There is some kind of parallels there that are worth worth assessing. Right. And we also, I think, the geopolitical implications of this, of course, are important. And how this reverberates, is worth watching there. But I think that's an insightful point, and something we haven't, a bit different, harking back to the 1960s in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, Moses, you want to ask your question in 15 seconds, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Ibrahim. So I think the cause of coups in most African countries, for me, it's greedy. But let me ask just a question in this line. We look at the case of Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe and Mnangagwa. What do you think was the best way of handling that situation, looking at how Mugabe held on to power, didn't want to let go, and as Zimbabwe had culminated into a lot of things? We had looked at the economic situation, the country, the political situation, was frustrated. So how could we, or how could they have handled that situation better than what they did? Of course, we don't support coups the way Mnangagwa came in, but what was the better way of handling
Cool. Fantastic question, Moses. Let's go to the other Moses, the professor. Could you help us answer that question in 20 seconds, please?
Maybe I could actually defer to Phil. I mean, my sense is that Mnangagwa was no different from Mugabe. They had been together. So it was, replacing one side of the coin with the other. Definitely Mugabe had made, matters very difficult for the country by clinging on to power. And this is part of the broader problem with African states, is that you have incumbents who personalize states and they become states in themselves, such that when they are kicked out of power by the military, there are all these celebrations that you see. But Phil might have a few better things to say on Zimbabwe than I can do.
Right.
Yeah, just quickly on this.
Prof, you're going to answer that question, but I want to add this to your question. Yeah. So John Mugabe, no pun intended, says in DR Congo, the Catholic Church was very instrumental in influencing a peaceful transition of power. So do you think there is a role for the church or religious institutions to play, or for civil societies to use religious institutions to help prevent coup? Is there a way this can be married? Also observing the careful thread between church and states in Africa. And you can also help us add that to your initial thought.
Yeah, so just quickly on the Zimbabwe, I mean, I think that was a stark example of the imbalanced constitutionalism, right? So they let Mugabe get away with, all of these, undemocratic, rules, and there was, some regional pressure, from neighboring states, fair amount, but there was not that, he wasn't decertified, or suspended from the African Union. And then when you have the coup, of course, there's some relief, but they absolutely shouldn't have let Mnangagwa, come to power, because he was in fact, orchestrating this coup. But I think there were several points where there could have been absolutely stronger response. Your question, Ibrahim, on the role of the Catholic Church also goes to the point that John Socrates makes about elite pacts. At the end of the day, we do have to think about these transitions of power. Being hopefully the people have free will and can select government rulers who they think best represents their interests, but we also know that powerful elites are not going to step down necessarily. So we do have to think about, are there roles for pacted transitions, and how do we strike agreements that can allow for alternations of power, allow for new room for new elites, allow for actors to step aside, and respected institutions like the Catholic Church can be very important in brokering these transitions. Right. So pacted transitions as an alternative to military coups, I think, are worth considering. That's also a tricky subject, of course, because pacted transitions can, institutionalize corruption, can let off the hook some of these actors. But it's another tool that has been used to strengthen democracy over the long run.
You're absolutely right. It's an option available, but we have to be really careful about it, as you said. Thanks for that. Magat Wade says, but the role of Russia is not to be overlooked, emphasizing the role of foreign actors in African military coups. We have some other comments, but anyway, I'm going to go to Freeman Musikemba. But Freeman, before I allow you to ask your question, I don't know if the professors are, if you are comfortable sharing your email or your Twitter, if your Twitter is open to receiving DMs. Because some of our colleagues will be willing to follow up. So either your Twitter that has DM options or your email address, if you don't mind. Okay, Freeman, can you ask your question now, sir?
Thank you, Ibrahim, for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, I was following up with the contribution from the speakers, and what caught my eye was, the examples that were given, like how ECOWAS was handling the military coups from Mali, Burkina Faso, and also judging their intervention, which they managed to make when the former president for the Gambia, Yahya Jammeh, refused to relinquish power after losing an election. And is within that background, and also looking at the Southern African example of how SADC christened coup in Zimbabwe, and choosing to term it like it's a coup, not a coup. And also we go to East Africa, we look at how IGAD has been detrimental at ensuring that the likes of South Sudanese president rules with impunity, and creating a new scenario which we can liken to an internal coup within the SPLMA, the ruling party in South Sudan, where he pushes away his vice president whilst consolidating his power, and the vice president taking with him.
We have to leave it there. I'm sorry, sir.
Okay,
we have to leave it there. Almost run out of time. Yeah, we get your point correctly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. These they just deceiving themselves, not us, because they tell you one thing and do another. You're absolutely correct, Freeman. So I want to give the final salvo to the two guests. I think we have permission to use maybe 1 or 2 extra minutes, so I'm going to use 1 more minute. Sekou, do you want to add your comments before we ask for the final comments from the guests? Your microphone is. You are muted, but we can't hear you. Okay, I think something's wrong with the audio jack. Okay, you can reconnect. Okay, they still can go up. We can go 5 minutes long if we need to. But yeah, I don't want to go that much. But the final salvo from you, two scholars, Professor Kisa, maybe in 30 seconds, what advice or general comment you want to give to our colleagues in the civil society working with think tanks? What should they take away from this conversation? The course of action for you.
Ibrahim, I don't know whether Sekou is back with his audio. You could give him the 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sekou, can you say something? I see that. Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks. I'm just gonna say hello to everybody, and I'm just from Guinea. Actually, right now we have a coup running, and I see that Philip Philip know very well what happened here, and the main problem we are facing, what this coup happened, is our institution is very weak. I think Moise talked about it. Why this coup happened in Guinea is because simply the institution is very weak, and AU and ECOWAS did not really help about it. And right now the coup happened, and we are facing a big problem because the military right now, they do not want to go, and they are trying to do their thing to see how they're gonna stay longer in power as long as possible. And my question with Philip and Moise is basically, don't you think like if you want to avoid this coup, don't you think like we need a very strong institution from inside and outside? I think the man, this is the question I would like to ask you. Don't you think if you want to avoid this coup, we need a very strong institution inside and outside? That's my question. Thank you.
Right. So sorry, Prof. Before I ask you to comment, I just want to read this 1 or 2 comments. So we have one from Donati Abdu. They say, I feel like we did not speak about the issue of legitimacy enough. Many leaders, especially in West Africa, get their legitimacy from foreign actors, right? The increasing willingness to change this paradigm among the youth creates a fertile ground for coups, correct? How can African scholars and civil society leverage the situation? Okay, I feel like I'm going to marry that with the question from Sekou and your final salvo. Professor Kiza.
Yeah, no, I think Sekou is absolutely right. I 100% agree with him. And I mean, the one thing that all of us Africans have to realize is that military intrusion in civilian politics has never been a solution to Africa's governance problems. The men and women in uniform have never been better governors than civilian leaders. So at the end of the day, I think it's incumbent upon African civil society and African publics to realize that, we have to build resilient civilian government institutions and not, think that the guys from the military are going to be a solution to governing. They are not, they are not any better governors, especially in terms of solving our endemic socioeconomic problems. And so, and coups and militarism tend to be very much cyclical, and they become an entrenched culture that becomes very difficult to break out. And rejecting the rule of the military, I think, is something that all Africans, have to do. About the person who was talking about legitimacy, definitely. And my new book, co-edited book, actually has a chapter on legitimacy, if somebody is interested in reading more on that. Rethinking Civil Military Relations is the title of the book. And we have a subtitle, Beyond the Coup, because, there are lots of coups that happen that are not the traditional type of coup. And so if we're thinking about the role of the military in African politics, it's important that we go beyond the headline, making traditional military coup, because the military does all sorts of things that are not necessarily military coups. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Before I ask you, Professor Rosler, I'll encourage everybody to please look up these amazing scholars. They are doing fantastic works on African politics and peace and conflict resolution and coups generally. So, Professor Rosler, in 30 seconds, because we're really out of time, we're literally out of time. 30 seconds, so we can close it out.
I think I just want to reiterate a point that Moses made about the importance of creating a culture rejecting militarization and the role of military in politics, right? So I think we have to think about coup d'états as a security problem, political problem, structural problem, but also social problem, right? We have to think about and this gets into legitimacy and legitimation. I mean, I think the reason we are even having this panel is because this uptick of coups can be contagious, right? We learn, we're social animals, we learn from each other. The military, in Burkina Faso seen coups in Mali and vice versa, and that does spread. But we should not lose sight of this sea change among the African public in rejecting coup d'états, right? If you look at Afrobarometer, 75% of the respondents, 48,000 respondents, in 2019, 2020, 2021, the most recent wave, disapprove of the military coming to govern the country, right? Now, there's really important variation across these countries that I think are worth, but if the military knows there will be no support for them, that there's strong social disapproval of their role in politics, that they are not supposed to govern, they are supposed to defend the country, that matters a lot, right? So I think the stronger, society, civil society can be in terms of, creating that culture of, civilian rule, the better for kind of democratic governance. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the gains that have been made, but we should also look at the challenges that exist and kind of double down our efforts. But really, over the long run, this cultural change is what's going to be so important for consolidating democracy.